All right, so in this video, we are going to cover section 3.1, demand, supply, and equilibrium in markets for goods and services. The goods and services market, things that you and I and everyone else buys, things that we produce at our jobs, things like that. All right, so learning outcomes: explain demand, quantity demanded, and the law of demand. Explain supply, quantity supplied, and the law of supplied. Identify a demand curve and a supply curve, and explain equilibrium, equilibrium price, and equilibrium quantity. So what is demand? Demand is the amount of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. Now, again, that's demand in the goods and services market, but that generally applies at any market. Note here that in economics, needs and wants are treated as indistinguishable. It's the willingness to purchase that we're interested in. That willingness to purchase is driven by a combination of desire and the ability to pay. So, for example, a person who doesn't have a driver's license, they might desire a car, but they don't have any effective demand for a car because they aren't able to use that car. There does need to be a logical connection there. So they may also not have the ability to pay because they don't have a job that pays well, since they don't have a car to get to a job. There may be other factors at play. All right. So price is simply what a buyer pays for a unit of a specific good or service. The quantity demanded is the total number of units consumers are willing to purchase at a given price. So there is a deep relationship here between how much of a good gets supplied, how much of a good is in demand, and what the price for that good is. We're going to focus on demand first, and then we'll switch over to supply. All right. Now, in demand, there's something called the law of demand. This law states that as prices increase, quantity demanded decreases, and vice versa. People don't want to pay high prices. That's the law of demand. People don't want to pay high prices. So the higher those prices start to go, the less the demand is, the less the quantity demanded is. There's an inverse relationship there. If prices start to come down, then quantity demanded goes up, right? There's an inverse relation. So, for example, if gas prices start to increase, people might drive less. They might carpool. They might take shorter trips, right? They're going to find substitutes. They might work from home more, right? So as those prices increase, the quantity of fuel goes down. And that law holds true even when other factors tend to remain constant, which is something that we call ceteris paribus, all others the same. So we're going to discuss ceteris paribus more later on. So we often represent demand using two different tools. The first is a demand schedule, and the second is a demand curve. A demand schedule is a table that shows the range of prices for a certain good or service and the quantity demanded at each of those prices. A demand curve is just the graphical representation of that demand schedule, and that curve on the graph shows the relationship between the quantity on the horizontal axis and the price on the vertical axis. So the demand curve always slopes downward because of the law of demand, and it'll make a little bit more sense when you see it. But first, let me show you the demand schedule. So this is an example of a demand schedule, table 3.1. It's just an example using gasoline prices. So you can see here at each price point, at each price per gallon, the quantity demanded changes. So as the prices go up, as you go down the table, the quantity demanded decreases. That's showing you the law of demand, that inverse relationship. And now here's an example of that same data, but graphed out onto a demand curve based on the demand schedule. So notice how it's created by graphing the points from the demand schedule. Each one of those points represents a row from the table. And then you can connect them all together with a line, and that line will always have a downward slope. And that is the visual representation, again, of the law of demand. For example, here, at a price of $2.20 per gallon, which is point D, way up at the top left here, consumers will purchase 420 million gallons of gasoline. But if the price goes down to $1, right? The quantity demanded will increase to 800 million gallons. So the quantity down here in the horizontal axis and the price on the vertical axis are what you're looking for. And demand will always slope down and to the right. All right. Now, it's important that we distinguish between demand and quantity demanded. Demand just refers to the overall relationship between prices and quantities, which is shown by the entire demand curve. Quantity demanded is a specific point on the demand curve. So here we have many different points along the demand curve. Each point is the quantity that is demanded, whereas the entire curve is what we would say reflective of demand. Okay, so a change in prices causes movement along the demand curve, but not a shift in the demand curve itself. We'll talk about what a shift is here soon. But as you can see here, the change in quantity is moving along that curve with price changes. It's not changing the curve. It's not shifting it from left to right. It's just prices are just moving along the curve. That's an important distinguishment, and it'll make more sense after you see a shift. So now let's take a look at supply, the supply side of the market. Supply is the amount of a good or service that producers are willing to sell at each price. Right? So demand is what we're willing to buy. Supply is what suppliers are willing to sell. The willingness is strongly influenced here by what the potential profits are. So, for example, higher gas prices are going to encourage companies to invest in exploration and refining and distribution of those natural resources of the fuel. Now, similar to demand, the quantity that is supplied is the total number of units of a good or service that producers are willing to sell at a given price. Right? And just like we have the law of demand, we've also got the law of supply, which says that as prices increase, quantity supplied increases and vice versa. So rather than being an inverse relationship, the way that law of demand is, where prices increase and quantity demanded decreases, here we have a direct positive relationship. As prices go up, quantity supplied goes up. That's because higher prices give you an incentive to produce more goods and services. You think you're going to make a better profit margin. So people will chase the profits. Just like with demand, though, this law is going to hold true even when other factors remain constant. Again, that idea of ceteris paribus, we're going to come back to that. All right. And similar to demand, supply can also be represented using both the supply schedule and a supply curve. Supply schedule, just like a demand schedule, is a table that shows the quantity supplied at a range of different prices. A supply curve is the graphical representation of that relationship with the price on the vertical and the quantity on the horizontal. So just like a demand curve, the price is on the vertical, the quantity is on the horizontal. The supply curve here, because of that normal positive relationship, that way, if I'm, it always slopes upwards and to the right. And that's, again, illustrative of the law of supply. So here's a table. Here is an example of a demand schedule using gasoline again. So you can see here at each price point, the quantity supplied changes. So as prices go up, the quantity that is supplied to the marketplace increases. And then here's the supply curve for gasoline. Supply curve is just created from graphing all of those points from the supply schedule table and then connecting them with the line. And so notice here, you've got that upward slope. That's showing you the higher price leads to a higher quantity supplied and vice versa. So it's that normal positive relationship, a positive correlation between higher prices, higher quantity supplied. So for example, at $1 per gallon down here, we're only supplying 500 million gallons. But if you increase the price to $2.20 per gallon, we'll be willing to supply 720 million gallons. Okay. Now, again, it's important to differentiate between supply and the quantity supplied. Supply is the overall relationship between prices and quantity. So that's the entire curve. And then quantity supplied is just a specific point on that curve representing a single price and its corresponding quantity. So a change in price, again, causes movement along the curve, but not a shift in the curve. That'll make sense when you see a shift. Now, we have to put supply and demand together. Market equilibrium is an important concept here. When you put supply and demand together, you can determine what is market equilibrium, which is the combination of price and quantity where there is no economic pressure from surpluses or shortages that would cause price or quantity to change. So in other words, it's where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied based on a given price. Right? The key outcome at equilibrium is the equilibrium price, and the equilibrium price is the point at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And then at that quantity, we call that quantity the equilibrium quantity. So the equilibrium point on a graph is reflective of the equilibrium price on the vertical and the equilibrium quantity on the horizontal. It makes a lot more sense when you visualize it and you see it in a graph. So before you can visualize it, to understand equilibrium, you have to first, in your mind, think about these two curves separate and apart. Okay, we've got our demand curve on the left that is sloping ever downward to the right. And we've got our supply curve on the right that is sloping ever upward to the to the right. All right. And so it's creating if you put them together like my arms are, you're going to create an X pattern. And that is what we have here. We have that X. We have a supply curve and we have a demand curve overimposed upon each other. And we can do that because our X axis and our Y axis, the horizontal and the vertical axis, are both price and quantity. So that's why we can combine these two together. And when you do that, that point where they meet is the equilibrium point. And that equilibrium point represents both the equilibrium price, which in this case is $1.40 per gallon, and the equilibrium quantity, which means that at $1.40 price, 600 gallons will be supplied to the market and 600 gallons will be demanded by the market. So that is the condition by which, if prices are at $1.40, everything else being true, we will not have a surplus or a shortage of our product. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that surplus and shortage idea. So let's define what that means, this idea of a surplus and a shortage. A surplus is excess supply. We have too much supply. That means that at the existing price, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity that is demanded by the consumer. So that happens when prices are above equilibrium. If we go back here, if prices rise to above $1.40, then say they go up to $1.80. Well, at $1.80, the quantity demanded is only 500 gallons, but the quantity supplied is almost 700 gallons. And so there is a discrepancy here. And that discrepancy is that the supply side would be happy to provide lots of fuel at $1.80 per gallon. The demand side is not going to buy all of it. And so there is surplus supply. There's too much in the marketplace. Now, the forces of law and demand are going to suggest to you that if we have a surplus, we realize we have a surplus because we're not selling it. Well, no, because we're not selling it and it's taking up all our tankers and our containers. Forces of the supply and demand will naturally want to converge back to that point of equilibrium. That's the idea at play in the marketplace, is that this interplay between how much is demanded and how much is supplied, eventually they should all converge back to the point at equilibrium. But that's the idea anyway. Okay, so that's the, here, that's what we're talking about when we say there's a surplus, there's too much product not being sold. The opposite of that is a shortage, where we have excess demand, too much demand. That means that at the existing price, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity that the suppliers are willing to give to the market, are willing to supply, because they don't think the profits are appropriate. There's not enough profit there. So that occurs when prices are below equilibrium. For example, at a price of $1.20, we come back to this, $1.40 is the equilibrium price. At $1.20, if we go below that point, then supply, we're only supplying about 550 gallons, because again, we're not making much in profits, but we're demanding 700 gallons, or 700 in million gallons. All right. So there's a discrepancy here where the demand is hot. We got lots of demand, but the supply side is not willing to supply that much because the profits are not appropriate. So there is a shortage. There is a shortage. And what happens when there is a shortage of a product? We see inflationary effects and we see price increases, and eventually we get back up to that equilibrium point. That is where supply and demand, eventually they converge back to equilibrium. All right. So this just further illustrates what we talked about, that at the price above equilibrium, anything above this point right here, point E, all of these prices up here are going to create a surplus or an excess in our supply. Anything below the point of equilibrium is going to create the excess demand or a shortage in the supply. And so there's going to be, at any point below $1.40, suppliers are not willing to supply, but the demand will be great. Now, like I said, reaching equilibrium is a dynamic process. If there's a surplus, that's going to put pressure on the market to reduce the pricing, leading to an increase in the quantity demanded, a decrease in the quantity supplied until we reach that equilibrium point. If there's a shortage, the market is going to put pressure on the pricing. We're going to put more price is going to increase. That's going to decrease the quantity that's demanded, increase what's supplied, and that's going to push us more toward equilibrium. So it's a very dynamic thing. You never know if we're truly at equilibrium or not. It's just a conceptual tool that tells you when there's a surplus, prices need to come down. When there's a shortage, prices need to go up to the point where we're at equilibrium. All right, so that's going to close out this video. In the next one, we're going to look at the shifts. What can change those lines, those curves? What can move them? Not the points along the curve, but the entire curve, the entire demand curve, the entire supply curve, which will obviously affect our equilibrium. So that's where we're heading in the next one. I will see you all in that one. Give me a holler if you have any questions as we move through these. I know this chapter may be a little bit long as we move through because it's a big topic, but stick with me. We'll get through it. Thanks, guys.